So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the New Bedford Coalition to Save Our Schools Community Forum on Reimagining School Safety, a conversation on police in schools. My name is Ricardo Rosa. Preferred pronouns are he, him. I am the co-chair. I am the co-chair of the NBCSOS along with Cynthia Roy. Our organization is committed to the resistance against the privatization of our public schools, including the resistance to charter school expansion, to building quality public schools, I should say, that are responsive to our community, and to addressing a range of public policies given their relationship to educational policy and outcomes. Most recently, we've been active in seeking a range of transformative policies related to police conduct, and that charges and disciplinary measures be taken against officers involved in the shooting of a 15-year-old boy in the city named Malcolm Gracia or Gracia. This work has been taken in solidarity with the leading organization on this matter, that is the Breathe Collective. So the NBCSOS released a public statement reimagining our school system given our public health crisis. The statement was released prior to the killing of George Floyd. And one of the calls that we make in the statement is to end police presence in schools, among other demands. For those interested in reading or knowing more about our organization, please visit nbcsos.org. We believe that educational policy and practice, indeed any public policy, should always be analyzed, from the perspective of those who bear the most social cost. We also believe that a pedagogical project must be built alongside ongoing organizing of our communities. So a transformative and inclusive school system can only be built when our community understands what that means. So we're deeply appreciative that our three presenters have taken the time to share their knowledge and experiences with us. This forum will open up with a 10 to 15 minute presentation by each of our presenters, followed by Q&A. Your questions may be placed in the chat box, and one of the moderators will retrieve it during the Q&A. Given the time, we ask that questions stay focused on the topic, that participants ask only to deeply understand, and that you also identify who the question is directed to, or state that it's open to anyone. We also ask that everyone in this call please identify themselves by name. So if anyone is showing with a marker that basically says iPhone or Galaxy, whatever, the organizers may ask folks to leave. We want people to identify themselves by name. For those wishing to participate in organizing and actions related to this topic and beyond, the Coalition's next meeting of the full membership is Thursday, July 16 at 4:30. Please leave your name, email, and number in the chat box, and we'll keep you posted about our meeting and actions in the interim. You may send the information privately by directing it to either Colin Green or Cynthia Roy in the chat box. So I'll now turn it over to Brittany Souza, our second moderator. There are a number of activists and organizers on the call today as well. If you have actions and events that you wish to share with the group, please place them on the chat box as well. So Brittany, are you there? Okay, so Brittany is not answering, so we're gonna move right along. Our three speakers are three of the best known scholars and scholar activists on the topic that we are discussing today. Of course, all three are also knowledgeable about other areas. I'm introducing the three presenters in the order of their presentation. They've written a great deal, so I'll only be touching on some of their selected works. Dr. Aaron Kupchik is Professor of Sociology and Criminal Justice at the University of Delaware. His research focuses on juvenile justice with interest in punishment and policing of youth in schools, courts, and correctional facilities, as well as inequality among juveniles. He is the author of a book called Homeroom Security, School Discipline in an Age of Fear, and The Real School Safety Problem, the long-term consequences of harsh school punishment. Dr. Erica Miners is Professor of Education in Women and Gender Studies at Northeastern Illinois University. She is author of several books, including Right to be Hostile, Schools, Prisons, and the Making of Public Enemies. She is the co-author of Flaunt It, Queers Organizing for Public Education and Justice. And she's also the author of two new books. One is titled Centering on the Child in the Struggle to Dismantle America's Carceral State. And she is the editor of The Long Term, Resisting Life Sentences, Working Toward Freedom. Dr. David Stovall is Professor of African American Studies in Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is the author of Born Out of Struggle, Critical Race Theory, School Creation, and the Politics of Interruption, and the editor of From Education to Incarceration, Dismantling the School to Prison Pipeline. Now, I'd like to invite our three speakers, our three presenters, if they haven't done so, to come to the screen. Our opening question is rather broad, and so feel free to take it whichever way you'd like. I mean, this is the first 10 to 15 minutes is your presentation, but should you need a question, we're going to ask that the presenters speak about their work broadly, and then about their work as it relates directly to this discussion on the presence of police in schools. So we're going to begin with Dr. Aaron Kupchik. Aaron? You good? Okay, 1 second here. Let me see what's going on. Aaron.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
There we go. First off, thank you very much for not just the warm introduction, but for this wonderful invitation. I'm humbled to participate with so many advocates doing amazing work, with two other amazing scholars, and hope that I can participate in a meaningful way, contribute rather in a meaningful way. I have a presentation. Let me share my screen. Oh, could you please enable screen sharing, Dr. Rosa?
Yeah, all set.
Okay. Here we are. As I see my role in these debates, I'm an advocate for children. I'm an advocate for stopping the over-policing, the criminalization, and the racialized treatment of children. And my role primarily is as a researcher first. So I want to discuss some of the empirical research that I've contributed over a number of years, as well as many others, that looks at potential harms of SROs. Now, there are some areas within this topic that we have uncertain or mixed evidence, such as about school shootings, student crime, mentoring, and whether SROs are effective at achieving their goals. And then there are other areas in which we see clear evidence of potential harms that tend to come to students. And I'll talk about each of these as well. As I'm sure most of you are aware, overall, the bulk of the evidence suggests fairly strongly that on balance, SROs are harmful to students in schools, despite often good intentions. Let me begin with some of the uncertain or mixed evidence. And one thing that people often want to discuss are school shootings. In my own district, there's a debate to reduce or eliminate SROs, and many people are afraid of the next school shooting. Thankfully, school shootings, though they don't seem that way, they're rare events. The most recent year, the government National Center for Education Statistics, that is, reported data for, there are 18 student homicides in schools, making school homicides, school-based homicides of students, one of the rarest ways for a young person to die on record. In 2017-28, according to the CDC, there were more. There were 31 homicides from multiple victim events. This was an unfortunate, horrific, tragic year. But these are still rare events, which means there's relatively little empirical analysis available. There have been shootings at some schools with SROs and some without. There are some stories of SROs having intervened, but these are fairly uncommon. So overall, there's really no sound empirical evidence showing that having a school resource officer, a police officer in school, can deter a shooting attack. What we do see to really works is having trusted adults in schools. For example, one recent study by Eric Madfis studied 11 averted school shootings. These were shootings that were planned by students but averted because, usually because another student found out and told an adult in the school. This happened when students felt that there was an inclusive climate, that they felt supported, respected, and valued. In 2 of the 11 cases, a student informed an SRO, but in the other 9, it was not an SRO. This coincides with the actual National Police Foundation's Averted School Violence Project. So this is a foundation very much dedicated to being pro-SRO. Finds that students need to remain aware, watch for warning signs, be vigilant, their parents be vigilant, but they still argue that it's about bonds. It's that what helps is having students connected to adults. Thus, what can prevent school shootings is trust, support, and bonds, but not necessarily law enforcement by the best evidence we have. If we think of more mundane student crime, research on this is inconsistent as well, in part because it's difficult to study. The causal effects are uncertain. If finding a correlation between placement or having an SRO in a school and high rates of crime, it's unclear whether the SRO is causing more crime or the SRO is placed in high crime schools. It's also difficult to study because SROs don't always behave the same way. There are many SROs who behave with hostility, with clear hostile and often racist intent, but a large number of SROs who adopt the mantra that they are there to help and support children and might not take that same hostility into it. I've observed many such SROs in my research. So whether they seek to mentor versus just do law enforcement, it can have very different effects on crime. A majority of the studies do show either no effect on crime rates or more student crime after adding SROs. Again, though, this can vary based on what SROs are doing. So overall, it appears that SROs do not positively influence or reduce student crime, though it's fairly inconclusive. The third area I wanted to discuss was having SROs as mentors or informal counselors. This is often touted as one of the best benefits by advocates of policing in schools. They see this as part of a triad model where the SRO has 3 main functions of law enforcement, educator, and informal counselor or mentor. And I certainly agree that more caring adults in a school can be beneficial, but research raises concerns about having police officers in that role. Certainly it adds potential surveillance or additional surveillance to children. There are more police officers watching them as they do normal adolescent things, which might be illegal. There's more likely for arrest. Students might unintentionally implicate themselves or others if their trusted mentor happens to be a police officer who must report knowledge of criminal behavior. And certainly SROs lack sufficient training relative to professional social workers or people specializing in adolescent development. In a recent study, co-authors and I find a shocking level of police officers discussing how one of their primary goals, just behind maintaining safety, is to teach students in their schools to trust police. The police are the good guys. The bad press about police is just a biased media based on bad apples. And they try to teach this. And we have many concerns, particularly for youth of color who are being taught in their schools that police are the good guys, arrests are the fault only of criminals and other things, who then take that potential learning into their communities and be met with hostility, have it contrast with their lived experience. So there are a number of areas where it's still unclear. There may be some benefits, but it seems on balance there are severe concerns. There are other areas where results seem very clear, such as arrests. Putting more police in schools leads to more arrests, particularly for minor crimes, such as simple assault and disorderly conduct, resisting arrest without any underlying charge. The minor things, not serious violence, and particularly for Black students. There are many reasons why. Having a police officer there every day means it's easier to detect offenses, certainly, but it also means there's more opportunity for escalation, more opportunity for a student having a bad day who's going to yell at whatever adult that is in their way and that happens to be a police officer who can't stand to have their authority questioned because that makes them seem weaker, which can be dangerous, and it leads to a criminal behavior, or in the eyes of the police officer at least. Another cause is that when we put SROs in schools, there's a very subtle shift of focus, the climate of the school, where behaviors become more likely to be seen as legal issues rather than social or mental health. And I'd be happy to illustrate that if I have more time and question and answer with examples from research that I've done. Another area where we see clear harms of putting police in schools is with increases in exclusionary disciplines such as suspensions. Now, the National Association of School Resource Officers, NASRO, which is the largest organization for SROs, argues that SROs should not be doing discipline in schools. And yet in the most recent nationwide survey from the Department of Education, 63% of secondary school administrators report that SROs do in fact participate in discipline. In a recent study, co-authors and I found, while doing research in a jurisdiction with an MOU stating that SROs don't participate in school discipline, that these SROs say they don't do discipline. But when we talk more about the things that they do and how they interact, it turns out that, well, they do many things that certainly we would consider discipline, such as reporting misbehavior that's not criminal, but violates school rules to an administrator, having harsh talks with students, and so on. What the research shows, expectantly, is that their suspension rates are higher in schools with SROs compared to similar schools without SROs. This research is now pretty consistent. There's a lot of high quality research, and that this effect is particularly felt by Black youth. As both of these last two slides show, youth of color, and particularly Black youth, bear the brunt of exclusionary discipline and arrest rates. So therefore, putting police officers in schools has a clear racial equity component to it. Again, youth of color, and particularly Black students, are disproportionately punished and arrested. This is obviously this is not news, I'm sure, to the audience today, but policing is certainly a part of this. It raises the stakes of the school environment in terms of punishment, in terms of surveillance, legal surveillance, in terms of likelihood of arrest. Research finds that student behavior does not account for these discrepancies. Particularly, this research is better developed when thinking of suspensions rather than arrest, but it's not explained away by student behaviors. Race matters independently. Implicit bias is obviously one factor, but not the only factor here, that students of color are more likely to be perceived as threatening by police officers and by school administrators. Long-term effects of this matter quite a bit, as students who are suspended in school suffer from the school to prison pipeline. They're less likely to graduate, they're less likely to eventually be employed, they're more likely to be involved in the justice system, they're even less likely to vote and volunteer in their communities years later. Also, when thinking about racial equity, we need to think about the extent to which police officers are watching. In research I've done, I've heard many SROs tell me that they're particularly concerned about students of color who might have a negative view of police, and so they want to build bridges. But what this means is they're spending more time with youth of color, particularly with Black youth, and therefore those youth are receiving more surveillance. In a recent study, some co-authors and I found that police officers stationed in different schools had different perceptions of threat and what their job was to protect against. In mostly white schools, the officers believed that their job was to protect the innocent students from external threat, such as a shooter, but maybe an angry parent or kidnapper. In schools with mostly youth of color in them, the SROs saw unruly students as the threat itself that needed to be policed. Clearly a racial component and leading to inequity. Before concluding, I also want to talk a little bit about school climate, because this is extremely important in thinking about how to best protect students, maintain school safety, and improve learning environments. School climate matters so much in terms of having connections between students. This climate refers to connections between students and each other, students and teachers, feeling supported, feeling listened to and respected. In subtle ways, the presence of police officers can make school climates less inclusive. Despite good intentions among many, it can still reduce trust, reduce bonds, and undermine rather than promote effective behavior management. Again, we see greater risk of this in our research in neighborhoods where police are distrusted, and also in areas following acts of police violence. So as I'm running out of time to conclude, I'm looking forward to more discussion. Again, I see my role here is summarizing some of a deep body of research evidence, which points to more potential harms than potential benefits to students of having police officers in schools, particularly with those harms particularly falling on students of color. Across the country, there are areas seeking to shift resources from SRO programs to emotional, social, and academic supports, which would be of enormous benefit to students. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kupchik. Much appreciated. Excellent presentation. I'd like to ask those who have questions to please write them down. Unfortunately, we're having an issue with the chat box. Hopefully, we'll resolve it by the end of all of the presentations. But if not, what we'll do is we'll ask whoever wants to ask a question to unmute and ask that question live, okay? Our next presenter is Dr. Erica Miners.
Hi, everyone. It's really an honor to be here today. I want to thank Ricardo for inviting me, and I want to thank the Coalition for all of your work. I'm just going to take about 10 minutes today, and I want to do 3 things in my 10 minutes. I want to just offer some gratitude for the work that you have been doing already, because I think much of the organizing that you have been doing has been building the pathway for creating frameworks for safety and security in our communities and our schools. And I am so grateful for you for doing that work. I want to offer a little bit of a snapshot. Second thing I want to do about what's happening in Chicago, because yesterday we had our school board meeting in Chicago about canceling the contract with the Chicago Police Department. So I just want to offer a little bit of an update about what happened there, just as a national part of a national snapshot. And the third thing I want to do is just add to Aaron's excellent summary of why SROs don't work, and just proliferate some ideas of restorative and transformative practices that I know that many of you are already engaging in, that we can be lifting up, because what I'm seeing in this moment is often a failure of imagination from our key policymakers and stakeholders, but also some of us, some of our families and some of our community members who are really grappling with how to let go of policing, for example, as a safety strategy. So those are the 3 things I'm going to do in 10 minutes. So just a little bit more about me. I really appreciate Ricardo's generous introduction, but I'm talking today more as an organizer. I'm a member of the Education for Liberation Network. I'm a member of Critical Resistance, a national anti-prison and anti-policing abolitionist network. I've built a number of programs. I teach at a university. I primarily identify as an educator, but I also have taught in a high school program for people coming out of prisons and jails that I started for almost 20 years now. I'm still teaching there. And I'm also, I work at Stateville Prison. I'm so excited to have my comrade Dave Stovall here in Chicago on this call as well. So I've done a lot of work at the intersection of education and incarceration, both as an educator, as an organizer, as somebody who does a little bit of writing and research, but more in support of social movements. So it's a little bit about me. So just back to my 3 things that I wanted to do. I wanted to first start with gratitude. I think this new Bedford Coalition to Save Our Schools, it's young people, it's parents, it's caregivers, it's grandparents, it's teachers, it's other school professionals. You have been doing the work to build the schools and communities that we need. You have been building alternative frameworks for safety, right, outside of policing. So I just want to lift up all the work that you've been doing, because I think it is part of the solution, and we can't lose sight of that in this moment. Challenging privatization and defeating charter schools is about making good working conditions for teachers, which is about creating good learning conditions for young people, right? That's a safety strategy. I think deepening ethnic studies, demanding ethnic studies, the work that you've been doing, the work that's happening nationally around that is a central plank in how we think about building safe schools and communities. I think that the organizing space, Souls, that you've created is also part of that. And I think the fact that the Massachusetts Teachers Association has taken up this demand for police-free schools is a direct result of the demands that young people have been making, right? That teachers have been making and parents have been making. So I just want to have gratitude for that, because this organizing work, which is as common as mud, as our poet, Marge Piercy reminds us, which is the having the meetings, flyering, going door to door, having the panel discussions, circulating political education materials, writing statements, going to the Board of Education. I mean, all of that work, all that cumulative work over years has brought us to this political moment. So I think that's so central to lift up, and that's collective work, that is collective struggle. And I'm so appreciative in particular of in my city, it's been led by Black and Brown youth, right? It's been led by Black and Brown community members and parents and young people. So I want to lift that up, important. So the second thing I wanted to do is talk a little about Chicago, just because yesterday, many of us were on the streets, but also listening simultaneously to different realities. To push back on the push for police-free schools in Chicago. Yesterday, our Board of Education had a meeting to cancel the $33 million contract that we currently have with the Chicago Police Department to provide SROs to schools. And we had actions in front and marches in the city of Chicago, even though there was thunderstorms coming through. There were people turning out, parents. And that campaign was led by groups like Asada's Daughters, the Logan Square Neighborhood Association, the Teachers Union, the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council, young people who've been pushing for this demand. I've been in Chicago for 20 years since I moved here, right? So I just want to lift up that genealogy, right? That trajectory is so important. It was a 4-3 vote. We have a majority of people of color on our school board. They're appointed, not elected. They report directly to the mayor, and the mayor, they serve the mayor in an advisory capacity. So we lost that vote. It was a gender split vote. The women were brilliant and on point, and the 4 cisgender men on the school board voted, had no facts to support them, but had a lot of feelings, and voted to keep the contract. But we'll have another opportunity to challenge that in August, when the renewing of that contract comes up. So thinking about these struggles kind of over the long term, that even though we lost this particular vote yesterday, I think the fact that we got 3 school board members
like threatening side things with a build up
based on fact and also on experience. So really, really important. So I just want to lift up that from Chicago, and of course, just, building a little bit, on Aaron's great summary of the data. We've had a number of reports come out over the last 20 years and even before about over-policing, racial profiling in Chicago public schools. Black women and girls experience school-based policing in Chicago public schools at 7 times the rate of white women and girls inside of Chicago public schools. So just thinking about this through an intersectional lens, we know that race, class, gender, sexuality, are all part of who's over-policed in Chicago public schools. So, those are the people who are often have the most, I was really appreciating Ricardo setting this up, that the people closest to the problem often have the best solutions. So I was really moved yesterday to say who's on the streets is, largely young people of color, lots of queer folks, lots of parents, just seeing who's on the movement. So the last thing I want to do, so Chicago, gratitude for the work that you're doing, sort of a quick update from Chicago, and just nationally, also Oakland, yesterday had a lengthy school board meeting, and they voted to cancel their contract, right? St. Paul's also did, Minnesota, and Minneapolis, of course. LA had a very sort of similar, it sounds like, struggle to Chicago, but I think that we even though we didn't win those exact the school board votes, I think that we're really going to grow, and I think LA is in the same position as Chicago. So the last thing I want to talk just a little bit about is what I hear often from parents, even teachers, and even people whose own family experiences or own bodily experiences are of being over policed or racial targeting, racial profiling. Because I think that our ideas about what makes us safe are often so colonized, so overdetermined by our carceral state, and carceral is just another way of saying punishing or policing state, that I think that part of this work, and I think this is what's been so helpful about the work that you've been doing and the work that many community organizations have been doing over the last decades, is just creating opportunities for people to sort of let go of policing and surveillance and borders and prisons as the logic that makes us safe, right? We know there's no, research, right, that, as Aaron pointed out, that police in schools don't make young people safer, and they result in higher rates of arrests and punishment for, in particular, Black and brown students, students with disabilities, queer and trans students. So we know the research says that, but there's an affective dimension here. So I think what's been really important over the last several years is all of these community forums and discussions where people are really trying to shift have that paradigm shift from thinking about safety and justice as punishment, right, and surveillance and policing, right, or thinking about safety and justice as, as having teachers that are look like you and come from the communities that you come from, and have the same, life experiences that you've had, right, or curriculum that looks like you. So so being able to make some of those shifts, right, as the amazing poet, Gloria Anzaldúa wrote many years ago, nothing happens in the real world first unless it happens, of course, in the images in our heads. So this shift, this demand to defund policing in schools has come from organizing where people have, made these connections that actually what makes our schools stronger and safer is feminist, queer, affirming sexual health education, right? Is curriculum and policy development and professional development that support educators to practice restorative and transformative justice, right? That what makes our schools stronger and safer is having librarians and nurses in every school, right? So thinking a little bit about that. So I want to end there because I know I want to have lots of dialogue, but I just wanted to sort of do 3 quick things as an introduction today. One is just to lift up and to acknowledge all the work that you're doing as part of this pathway to creating stronger and safer communities and schools, to just offer a little snippet about what's happening in Chicago as reflective of what's happening nationally, and not seeing this political moment as an important political moment, but also, even though we technically didn't win that battle, yes, here is the importance of really creating political educational materials, containers, and spaces for people to think and practice and talk about transformative and restorative justice and practices that really make our communities stronger and safer, that hold people accountable for harm, that transform the conditions that made that harm possible. And some of that is preventative, right? And some of that is reactive. So I'm gonna stop there, and I'm really looking forward to discussion and hearing from Dave and more engagement. So I'm gonna mute myself.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Miners. Much appreciated. At this time, I'd like to call Dr. David Stovall.
Peace and greetings, everybody. And thanks again for the coalition for having me and doing the work that you do, because you all really represent what it means to do transformative work in schools. And I want to lift up and thank Aaron and Erica, Aaron, whose work I know, who I'm just seeing face to face, and then Erica, who is a comrade that we've worked together for over the last 20 plus years in various educational and activist formations. So what I wanted to do today, and Erica just gave you all the recent events was happening in Chicago, and then what has been the demand that people need. I want to take us, and I'll make sure that my time is short because I do want to spend more time in dialogue, but I want to take us through some understandings as to why people are arguing against having police in schools. And I'll use the locale of Chicago because that's the space that where I'm from, what I'm familiar to. And then I've been at the University of Illinois at Chicago over the last 20 years. I've been working with young folks and families over the last 30 years. And I, like Erica, have been in numerous formations that address the school prison nexus, that seek to end all forms of carcerality and look to actually lift up education over schooling. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But this idea of actually understanding policing and why folks are making this argument in Chicago and in Oakland and in St. Paul and Minneapolis comes from a particular rationale that I think is important. That when we talk about racialized bodies, particularly Black and brown folks, and in this case, Black folks, there's always been a rationale in schools and in communities around containing them. And when I say containing them, I'm meaning keeping them away from white protected areas. So in a lot of cities like Chicago, where I'm at, one of the spaces that is protected is an area not just called downtown, but the central business district. And many of your various locales have a central business district. And that's where police are actually developed to keep people out. And I think it's important, and in our rationales, when we talk about theories of policing, it's very important to recognize not just the history of police in terms of slave patrols in the South, but also the importance of police in the protection of property before the protection of people. And I think when we consider that particular relationship, when we understand that policing is more in tuned around the protection of property before it is the protection of people, then we see these particular manifestations in schoolhouses. And going back to about 20 years ago in Chicago, what happened was there was a set of rulings that actually put makeshift police stations in schools. Now, I want folks to actually think about that for a second. So in Chicago, we have a place on 26 in California that is known as the Cook County Jail, which also operates as central booking. So if you are charged with a crime, you are centrally booked at 26 in California, usually. And this is after arrest. But there were a couple of schools in Chicago that had operating police stations. So you could be booked in a schoolhouse and then taken to central booking. And they had arrest bars, so you could be handcuffed to a bar. You could also be strip searched. So these things were happening to young people inside of a school. So now the question that we have to think about is, what does that mean for a young person who understands that in the place where they're supposed to be learning, there is a mechanism that could arrest, detain, and marginalize them? And I think this becomes important because at the same time in Chicago, there was also a campaign by the Chicago Police Department to get M5 rifles because they were supposedly outgunned by gang members. And just for folks who don't have a context of what an M5 rifle is, an M5 rifle is an anti-tank weapon. So this is a weapon that could potentially, if shot in a particular way, could blow up a house. And this is what the police department was arguing to actually combat Black people in Black neighborhoods. So in addition to you being sequestered, detained, marginalized, and arrested in a schoolhouse, you could potentially have your home exploded by the same group of people. So when we talk about long-term trauma, or what psychologists refer to as a longitudinal trauma or sustained trauma, we need to look no further than the police department in terms of what those sustained traumas look like. Now, at the same time, I think it's important when we talk about getting police out of schools, we have to engage something that Erica actually put me on years ago. Instead of thinking about a school to prison pipeline, we need to be thinking about, and a school to prison pipeline, I should say, is this idea that school is the place that prepares you for life under incarceration. And I would argue in many of our instances, in many of our cities, we live under a different condition. We actually live in a space where there is a school and prison nexus. And this is what I mean by that. So Erica and I teach at a prison called Statesville. And in Statesville, once you enter the doors, they have a sign, a yellow sign on the right side of the wall that says, please step to the right. They have a piece of yellow tape that goes down the hallway. And it's called a passing lane. And the idea behind a passing lane is if there is any type of instance or action, the corrections officers can actually move on that action while everybody else is stepping to the right. Now, I look at this, and you walk through a couple of hallways, walk through a couple of metal detectors, you walk in, you see this sign, please step to the right, you see a yellow arrow on the floor. Now, I want to take folks 3 weeks later after me seeing this, I was actually going to visit a former student in a classroom. The exact same signage was in the building. Please step to the right. Yellow lines, students in uniform, had to walk down the hallways with their hands behind their back. So if I'm seeing the same logics in a prison that I am in a school, then we're no longer talking about a pipeline. We're talking about a school and prison nexus. These things are the same place, depending on what you look like, where you live, and your experience in Chicago. So what the young people yesterday were demanding and protesting and rising up against is this age-old practice of containing them. So policing has never been about the safety of the young folks in question. Instead, policing has always been about the containment of certain populations. And dare we say, the populations by that police force and the city that has been deemed disposable. So in Chicago, and like you all may experience in New Bedford and throughout Massachusetts, there are populations of people who have been deemed valuable, and there are populations of people who have been deemed disposable. And when we talk about ending the presence of policing in schools, we're talking about understanding Black and brown folks as being valuable in opposed to being disposable. We believe these are the folks who can change our conditions, then why would we put them under elongated trauma that gets them further away from the capacity to change their condition? And I think this becomes important because SROs and police in schools are often taken out of context. And these contexts, I think, are critical in understanding what is happening to young folks. And I'll stop with this understanding. A lot of times, and this is why I really appreciate Aaron's work. A lot of times when people ask young folks about what they think is safety, the wrong question that people ask is, do police make you feel safe? I would argue that's the wrong question. We need to be thinking about asking young people what makes them feel safe and wanted in a school. And that's a very different question, because when you take police out of the equation, we now get closer as to what Erica mentioned in terms of what people need. And if we center our work in the express needs of people who are experiencing the oppression, then we have a greater chance to move towards a solution. And I think this is where we need to concentrate our efforts when we talk about getting police out of schools and understanding the context in which this exists. I'll stop right there. Thank you all again for having me. I truly appreciate it. And if I've gone too long, the mistakes are mine. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, David. Excellent presentation, Dr. Stovall. Much appreciated. Folks, if you have a question, I'm going to ask you to just unmute your camera and at the very bottom of your camera, there's a function that says reactions. And if you could just hit on the clap symbol, and then we'll get to your question as soon as we're able to, okay? But I'd like to begin with this question for any of our speakers. So, you know, many schools in Massachusetts whose student body is overwhelmingly white, say 90% white, they also have SROs. And the faculty and staff at these schools are very much in favor of keeping those SROs. So they're not really thinking about, you know, urban contexts that are very diverse or predominantly Black and brown. They're thinking about their schools. So how do we open up this conversation with white families and white teachers, educators in these areas? For anyone who wants to take it.
Hi. Do you mind if I,
Sure.
David, were you about to go?
No. Go ahead, Aaron.
Thank you. And by the way, both you and Eric, I appreciate your comments very much and learned quite a bit. Thank you. But in response to the question, that's, you know, precisely what I've been dealing with all day today as the school district my kids are enrolled in, which is majority white, is contemplating removing SROs. And there's a tremendous backlash from the white parents, right? I made the mistake of looking at Facebook earlier and, well, it was disturbing. You know, and so this is what I've been thinking about all day and yesterday and the day before. You know, and that's why I try to put my empiricist hat on, and that was much of the presentation I presented to you, right? I have an advocate hat I can wear as well. The advocacy work here in this amazing organization is being done so much better than I could do. So my job here is the empirical hat, and I try to discuss with those audiences how it's not in their children's interests either to have police officers in schools. Those are the schools, and I've been in many such schools where the SROs, they really do care. I think they see those kids as valuable. They want to protect them. They want to mentor them, right? Those kids get the benefit of that value that David powerfully discussed, right?
Yeah.
And still, those schools have higher rates of suspensions and arrests for minor defiance than do other schools. So even in, you know, that's why I often try to present these scenarios as, you know, sometimes almost like an apologist, like deferring, what if we assume best case scenario that these SRO programs truly are implemented the way that NASRO says they are or should be, right? These SROs are well trained. Even in those scenarios, even if one imagines that, as is more likely in a mostly white district, it still is harmful to students in terms of changing the climate, more arrests, more school punishment.
Got it. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Aaron.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. Anybody else care to take it on, or I can ask one more question? Erica? Yeah. Go right ahead, Erica.
To unmute me. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think either you unmute me or I unmute me. Great question. I mean, it's sort of like my first response is, you know, getting white people to unlearn and challenge white supremacy. Schools are probably all white in part because of histories of opportunity hoarding and redlining and racial residency restrictions. So, you know, I think that those sorts of histories of space and place and race are always something that we need to be teaching, and that white people need to be working with other white people to dismantle, to change, to name. So I think that is always part of the equation, is always central. So I want to just lift that up to begin with, and to say how white people and organizations that are invested in challenging white supremacy can create those kinds of opportunities for political education, opportunities for thinking differently, right? So the second thing I also wanted to name is that, you know, I think we're at a political moment where We can use some of the discourses around austerity logics, right? The amount of, I mean, what Chicago Public Schools has done really well, young people and organizing has said, you know, for every, you know, we could, I don't think I mentioned it in my talk, but how many nurses and psychologists that we could get in schools, the $33 million. We could get 317 social workers, 314 school psychologists, and 322 nurses. So I think that's one lens, right? I think that making the case around restorative and transformative justice, I do think that that is something that parents, you know, often want for they practice in their own home, right? Practices of restorative justice in terms of parenting. So lifting that up as a strategy. But I don't want to separate the advancing restorative justice or pushing or using the argument around economics from the imperative of also challenging white supremacy, right? Because I think that you know, we need to be making those connections always, that the history of policing in the United States cannot be disconnected from colonialism. It cannot be disconnected from white supremacy, right? So I think that that work has to happen at the same time.
Thank you immensely. Thank you. Kelly, I believe Kelly has a question. Kelly, would you like to come on?
Yes, thank you. My issue is this: the school that I teach at, Greater New Bedford Voc Tech, our school resource officer is a female. She's a woman of color. She's a phenomenal role model to all our students. Aside from our custodial staff, I can count on both hands, no toes, how many minorities we have as teachers. We have one middle manager, administrator. The rest are all middle-aged white males. So to me, it hurts my heart because our officer is an amazing person. She's part of a community. She has gotten our students, who some of them have been at-risk students, she's transformed their lives and gotten them into the junior police academy. Some of them have gone on to become officers themselves. And believe me, I am not blind to what goes on in other areas, in other schools, even in Massachusetts alone. But I just think that there's got to be a better way to get the right people in, because instead of just alleviating school resource officers in school, if we get the right people, we could make an incredible difference to heal this, you know, gross fractured divide that there is between all the, you know, community issues and the kids that attend school. I definitely am 100% in agreement that things need to change. You know, to become a teacher, you need a master's degree. To become a police officer, I don't know, but I know it's a lot less training. We don't carry weapons. We don't have the authority, although we can ruin someone's life psychologically or with a discipline record, you know, if we needled away at it. We don't have the power and the capacity that they have. So why is it that there's such less training and such less accountability for people that are enforcing the law as others? So I really think that's where we need to look to begin changing things. And I see it a little bit differently, where the school resource officers, we could actually have them healed. That's just my opinion.
Kelly, who would you like to direct the question to?
David.
David?
Yeah, David, because he's got a completely different experience coming from Chicago. I see all of that stuff. I haven't lived that. And I'm just curious if, you know, anything that I've said, if you've experienced the positives or if it's all been negatives.
Well, again, thanks so much for that question. I think it's important because there's some contextual issues. And as soon as you explain, and thank you for explaining that situation, but as soon as you explain that situation, the first thing I thought about would be, what if your SRO had their occupation completely changed, right? What if the district paid for her to get her teaching license and be in the schoolhouse in a similar capacity and work with those young folks in the capacity that you have described them in, right? Because the thing is, and I think this goes back to Aaron and Erica's points. When you put folks in the position of law enforcement, now they have automatically sided with the enforcement of any type of disciplinary infraction. The idea, when we talk about getting police out of schools, is being able to get in front of an issue largely before it happens, because you have the staff of counselors and wraparound services and various teachers and teachers of color in that building who can relate to your students. I think this is the long-term issue that I think becomes important. When we think about this long-term and we talk about transforming a school space, we now have to talk about what are the mechanisms at our disposal or that we need to create to now put folks in positions where they can engage young folks, not with the arbiter of having law enforcement attached to it, right? Because even though that is a good person that you describe and is doing good work, at any given moment, she can arrest you, right? And that thing is still open. She may not operate in that way, but it's important to understand that position, because when she's not there and another SRO comes in that space, then everything that she's done goes out the window, right? And it's right back to order, compliance, isolation, and marginalization. And I think this becomes important because when people talk about SROs being in relationship with students, the question I'm always asking is, but we still have the capacity at any given moment to remind them of their imprisonment, right? And that to me, I think is the fundamental problem. We have to be willing to shift that space. And I've actually seen that happen where folks decided to get police out of schools, and there were some SROs who actually, the district paid for them to actually go and get their teaching licenses. So I'm not saying that as just something out of the sky, but we've actually seen districts do this, right? So I think this moment, especially when we talk about this moment of unrest, this moment allows us the opportunity to rethink those things.
Aaron, you look like you really want to jump in there. And Erica.
I was appreciating David's comments very much. I don't think I can say it any better. I mean, I think that that person being a police officer is very, very meaningful. And I've, Kelly, it's a wonderful comment. I've observed many wonderful SROs, many terrific SROs that function in very similar ways. And I've also observed when the switch flips and those wonderful, caring SROs think a crime has been committed and they start to kick ass. Like they go into cop mode very quickly and with force, right? And so, yeah, the fact that she is an officer is still meaningful. And I respect her greatly based on your description and the wonderful work she does. And it would be a shame to lose a wonderful person like that. But we need to rethink having police officers in schools.
Thank you. Thank you. And Erica, you had something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in to make one additional point, but thank you for that question. And of course, my comrades on the call are brilliant. But I also think budgets are moral documents as well, right? And if we are spending millions of dollars on policing, right, those millions of dollars aren't available for healthcare, they aren't available for classroom.
She's frozen there for a second. Yeah. Are you there, Erica?
Yeah. Am I still here?
Yep.
Did I
you froze a little bit.
I teach and I teach justice studies classes, and I get many young first generation men of color who take those classes who want to be police officers because there's something, because one, they're hiring, right? That corrections is always hiring, police is always hiring, and Chicago Public Schools, that profession, teaching, is seen as gendered labor, it's seen as racialized labor often, it's devalued, right? So I do think that kind of coming back and thinking, like I don't think it is about individual people, but it's also about the structures and systems. Like, why is it that teaching isn't working in arts programs with young people isn't highly valued and highly compensated, right? So I think that that's very important. And I'll just come back to Dave's point. Like if we had, if we had fields of teaching and art workers and poets and musicians that was highly compensated, respected, seen as important work in communities and compensated, right? I think that's a really important intervention. So thinking about that just at the structural level.
Great, thank you. Cheryl, you have a question.
I do. I actually have two questions. One's really got a short answer though. So my first question is sort of referring to this in a historical way, because I graduated from New Bedford High School in 1993, and I don't remember us having an SRO. So I'm wondering, when did that start to become the norm, and what was the impetus for that? So that's my first question. And then my second question sort of piggybacks on what Kelly was saying earlier. And I did hear the gentleman say that, being a police officer definitely has more significance in terms of a person's identity and the way they're perceived by students than anything else. But have there been studies that show a difference between the way that students respond to a person of color as an SRO versus a white person as an SRO?
All right. And are you directing that question to anyone in particular or the entire panel?
Anyone who feels they can answer is fine.
Thank you. So let me just say, Cheryl, if you want the particulars of Massachusetts and how police officers were introduced into schools, there's an excellent podcast by Jack Schneider, who's a professor at the University of Lowell, and the podcast is called Have You Heard? Mm-hmm. The latest segment is precisely about that issue. But I can tell you that in Massachusetts, they were introduced, I believe, in the 60s and early 70s, and really as an effort to stymie down or stop dissent, given the protests that were going on with regards to wanting integration into schools.
Okay.
So that's the reason why police were actually put in schools in Massachusetts. But that podcast will give you a great insight. There are three historians
Thank you.
Present there, okay? If
Yes.
anyone else wants to jump in.
Can you say that podcast name again though first?
It's Have You Heard? And it's a podcast by Jack Schneider, who is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, who does a lot of work on alternative systems for assessment other than high stakes testing in schools.
Thank you.
Yep.
I rely on Dave as my historian because I feel like he is a better historian than me. But yeah, my read of the literature supports your point, Ricardo, that most police were implemented in schools as a direct response to Black liberation movements. And I'll also flag a book by a comrade, Damien Sojoyner, Sojoyner, that looks at sort of the really express way in which police were put into LA and Southern California schools, as a just a direct response to trying to manage Black liberation movements, kind of point blank, and other freedom struggles. So I think that was the first, but I feel like Dave is a better historian than me.
No, that's right. That's right and exact. And it's largely generated around the Tinker decision, right? So the Tinker Supreme Court decision was around a group of young folks who were protesting the Vietnam War. And they wore a black armband. So one of the ways to actually control dissent was to have people in those spaces to actually police young people. So this thing around, like, you had Black liberation movements, and then the Tinker decision allowed for a court precedent for folks to actually get law enforcement in schools. And Aaron probably knows this better than me, but to your second question, this idea of, and we know a lot more of this outside of schools. So there's a large set of data that people were collecting in the 80s around if you changed the race and ethnicity of the police officers would it change treatment of racialized groups in the United States? The overwhelming data told us no. And in fact, in some communities, they would even record being treated worse, right? So I think there's a real important piece around here, because we say that we do the same thing with teaching, right? We say, well, look, if we get more Black and brown teachers, will that improve educational outcomes? And the question is maybe, right? I should say the answer is maybe, because the most important thing of when you talk about Black and brown teachers teaching Black and brown students is their capacity to understand the situations that their students are going through, and to adapt instruction in ways that their students find to be relevant. That's the key component, right? More so than the race and ethnicity, but race and ethnicity is important because there are Black and brown students who have been locked out of the teaching profession. But when we drill down, what's even more important is them understanding the conditions and situations of their students and making instruction relevant to them, right? So I think that really becomes important when we drill down. It's not just the presence of similar looking people, but it's people who actually are willing to understand and act on their understandings.
Thank you. Go ahead, Erica. I think you're muted, Erica. Let me, there you go. I have to unmute you. Let's see here. I don't know why that is happening.
Sure.
Okay.
I know, it's like back and forth. I unmute, you unmute. I just want to make a point about language too, like this language of school resource officer, you know, and I think we need really paying close attention. You know, I do a lot of work around prisons, and one way that we sort of become accustomed to something is if we call that immigration prison a detention center, right? Mm-hmm. Or so I think, but we want to call them police. They're armed personnel, right? They're trained to do chokeholds, right? They're trained in, interrogation techniques. So I think it's really important to think structurally and systemically here about, and to resist the kind of language that the state is offering us to sort of neutralize the violence, a school resource officer, or to be ahistorical about it, right? So I think reminding ourselves to call these people, this profession, policing, right, or law enforcement, I think is really central, because the push for officer friendly is a PR campaign that has a long trajectory, right, and is very intentional. And to have us see, like on my campus, the main job, one of the central jobs that the police do is unlock offices for people like me that are slow and always lock themselves out, right? But do we need an armed personnel person to do that? Do we need somebody with a weapon to do that? Do we need, police? So just trying to make sure that we're making visible the institutional position, the training, and the language, and not falling for the way the state is trying to get us to obfuscate that.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Mandy, and then we have Eric. Mandy?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
So I have a question. I'm from Spain. I came here when I was 12 years old. I went through the bilingual program and I graduated from New Bedford High School. I'm also a New Bedford public school teacher. And my question is, because I hear this a lot, how do we stop the prison pipeline from happening? And is it only happening in public schools, or is this also happening in private schools? And like David said, he mentioned how when he worked in the prison, he saw a correlation of the prison system being correlated to what's happening in public schools. Is that prison to pipeline only happening in our public schools? And if it is, why? How can we stop it? How can we do better? I can hear. Okay, thank you.
Yep. And Ricardo, can I go ahead?
Sure, David, go ahead. Go right ahead.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that question, because I think this thing around, well, first, your earlier point, we don't see this as much in private schools. Now, there is a particular point around this, and you all in Massachusetts have a unique relationship. You all got these high-end boarding schools, these high-end prep schools in Massachusetts, right? That's a really unique, just kind of a funny story. I never knew what the hell a prep school was until I got into college, right? Until I ran into folks who went to prep schools. And in prep schools, they don't report any criminal infractions, right? So I think that's important to put on the stage. So in private schools, is that happening? Absolutely not, right? Because that group of people are protected and viewed as valued and are largely white. So I think that's an important point to make. And you all in Massachusetts have a particular set of relationships with that. And, you know, all the stories that come out and actually research reports that talk about sexual assault in terms of boarding schools and prep schools. But this idea around ending the school prison nexus, right? One of the things that we have to be clear about is that relationship, right? And we have to be honest about what these things mean. And one of the ways to do better is to begin to ask questions of how the school functions, and dare say we ask our students as the arbiters of how they understand the space, right? Because we often in school space, especially K-12 space, we still prioritize the responses of adults, right? We very rarely ask young people what is needed in those spaces. And I think one of the ways to interrupt that is to begin to ask young folks what's needed, right? And when you start to ask folks what's needed and what the problems are, now you can see a different set of relationships, right? This goes all the way from your sorting machine in terms of honors, AP, regular track, whatever you call it, right? Your who's in your classes around education and careers, who's in your college prep class, who goes to the military. And, you know, all these groupings get racialized. And one of the ways to do better is to rethink completely how we understand schools. Now, I'm going to make a couple of radical suggestions here. And for the school teachers who are on the phone, K-12 school teachers on the phone, you know, if you hang up, I get it, but let's go there. What would it mean to be in a school where you no longer had grades, right? Let's think about that, right? Because now you can't separate these weighted GPAs, or in a 4-point system, students getting 5.0s, right? That makes no fucking sense, right? And that thing around really being clear about that, because who does that advantage? And who does that value in that space? What if we got rid of high stakes testing, right? Did it, right? University of California system just made the ACT and SAT optional. You all in Massachusetts have a ton of liberal arts schools who have made the SAT and ACT optional, and your admission is actually through a portfolio system, right? So we have precursors to do this work. We're now talking about will. So when we talk about doing better, we only have to look for the examples that are right in front of our face. The question is, do we have the will to do it, or will it upset people in power too much that we don't want the drama of dealing with those folks who are in power, right? And I think that's where our work needs to rest. So doing better really means to rethink all the practices that in somewhere on the planet or even in your state is already done. If you think about those prep schools, you're instantaneously admitted to college just by way of your association with that prep school. You could be a quote unquote D student. You're still in, right? By way of some legacy admit, right? Because you got a relative who went to that particular school that school prioritizes with the hope that they're going to get some financial return with that, right? So this thing around really doing better, and I really appreciate that question, but doing better means to look at those spaces that now bring the folks who have historically been on the outside into the center of our analysis, right? And the center of our analysis as valuable and not as the people to be marginalized. And I think that's critically important when we talk about our work moving forward.
May I jump in? I think that's amazing. Thank you very much. And those are amazing ideas that would just be so wonderful for kids and making a better environment. And I think there are even smaller things that we can do too. I always point to suspensions, right? And how would a suspensions make no sense to me either. Talk about GPAs. Suspensions make no sense to me. I completely get, Mandy, I know you said you're an educator. I understand the struggles, or I can imagine the struggles of trying to teach to 30 students, and one is making that difficult, right? But imagine if we approach that differently, right? Instead of saying you're gone from the school or moving that student, right? Instead of removing them, what if we actually, tried to solve their problems? Now, you trying to teach to 30 might not be able to do that because, well, you've got a tough job and little time and a lot of demands, going back to standardized testing and all the pressures that are placed upon you. But where there's so many resources that we can put up metal detectors and surveillance cameras and police officers and, in-school suspension rooms and so on, there's money for punishing. There doesn't seem to be as much money for helping and supporting and uplifting kids so that they can reach their potential. Right? They are kids at promise, not at risk, and getting them or helping them rather, to find their way. What if we treated kids more like, and here I'm not necessarily talking about the teachers who are overwhelmed, but how we imagine schools. What if we treated them the way we treat kids and families, right? When I talk about this subject, I often ask people to think about families. If you have children, if you have nieces, nephews, people you love, they can frustrate you to all hell, right? They can be difficult. They can make you pull your hair out, as I've shown. But they're still members of your family, and you still love them, and you still include them. We try to correct behaviors. We try to show love, not the door, which is what suspension is an act of. What if we showed that love to the students who most need it in schools, right? Particularly students of color, who are the ones who are most likely to meet the in-school suspension or be suspended out of school or be arrested. But once we show the students that love in simple terms of just redirecting our energies, reinvesting our resources, I think that would go a long way to reducing that school-prison nexus.
Thank you, Eric. Aaron, thank you. Eric, Andre, you're next. Eric, are you there?
Hello?
Yes.
Mr. Rosa, this ain't Eric Andre. This is Eric Rudolph, though. I'm
sorry, Eric.
I'm good, brother. How you doing, man? I'm
doing
glad
good, man. Doing good. Go right ahead, man.
I'm glad that you guys actually involved me into this Zoom meeting. What Brother David was saying was pretty much phenomenal. I just need 2 minutes, well, actually 5, maybe even less, because what I'm about to play you is from Jaden Smith, who is Will Smith's son, on the correlation between prisons and schools. And I want you guys to hear this. This is something that you guys need to hear.
I have no other hands up, so we're good, brother. Go ahead.
I'm going to play it right now, so I hope everyone's listening.
They're not just trying to go and do criminals and do messed up things. People are trying to survive. People are trying to support their families. And that's what's just so fucked up. And if we gave people an option, another way, more jobs, more education, so that they could support their families, then maybe we wouldn't have everybody in the prisons. But guess what? They want us in the prison because that's how they're going to make money.
Oh, yeah. And they keep them full. And we've built more prisons in 1 year than we have built schools in the last 10, 20 years, bro.
It's just so...
it is a system. And they look at your kids saying, okay, the dad is here, and in 10 years we'll have you. And then in another 5 years, we have your little brother.
And we're preparing everybody to go to prison through the schools. Yeah. It's like, oh, okay, the people that are not doing good in the grades, and you're doing like this, you left in detention, da-da-da-da. There's too many correlations between public schools and prisons. The fact that you have the long hallways, the fact that you have a fixed response to authority, the fact that, there's a specific time when you can go outside and play, and then there's a specific time that you can come back in. And the way that you're notified with that happening is through the bells. They're subconsciously getting you to have a fixed response to authority and understanding what it's going to be like when you are in prison. It's like, no, when you're here, you have to listen to me. I'm in charge now. I'm going to pass you off to this next person is in charge when you're doing this. And it's like you have these fixed response to authorities, and then you know how to read. And it's just like, oh, okay, you went to school, all right, you already know how it's going to go in prison. You got the bells, you got the times where you can go out and you have to come back in, and your authority figures that you have to respond to. You've already been trained for this. Your whole life, you've been bred for this. Yeah. The same way that they're breeding, the same way that they're breeding animals and slaughtering them and then feeding it to all of us is the same way. That's what they're breeding us to go into prison. They're breeding us, or they're breeding us to go to school and learn how to work a 9-to-5 or work to a factory. Like, school was invented for the Industrial Revolution because people were cutting their fingers off in the factories because they couldn't read the instructions. So they were like, oh, people are literally killing themselves in these new factories because we just discovered how to do all of this stuff. So put them in school 9 to 5 so they get used to waking up 9 a.m. and then finishing at 5 p.m. They get used to the bells. They have the bells in the factories too. They have the
and that's just a brief like he kept going on about it, and that's what disturbs me is how some certain schools are the correlation between schools and prisons are too similar. You know what I'm saying? It gets us ready as colored people to actually be prepared to go to prison, to listen to authorities. Whenever you get to go out and eat, you know what I mean? That's a specific time when you get to go out and eat. Or when you go out and recess, what do dudes in prisons do? They get 1 hour rec time. Some prisons might be different. You know what I'm saying? So right. My whole thing is I want to take police officers out of schools completely. They're getting paid for no reason. Let's look at the history too. When it comes to school shootings, none of the police officers that are there to get paid to protect our children or protect us really do anything. So what's the point of them even being there when we could invest into new programs,
right?
New stuff for the community. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Eric, let me give anybody on the panel a chance to respond should they want to. We have one more person waiting to ask a question, Wendy, and I want to respect the speaker's time. I did tell him till 5:30, and I want to stay to that, okay?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. Anyone want to respond to that? Or okay. Wendy, you're next. Wendy, are you there? Cindy, would you unlock Wendy, please?
I think I'm unlocked now.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Mine's a two-part. It's one is just making a comment, and then the other part is the question. I just wanted to say, like, it's actually disturbing to think that anybody would want police officers in the schools and view them as good for disciplinary prevention. Like, they see it as, well, if they're in the schools, then they're less likely to behave a certain way. They're less likely to behave a certain way, so they see it as preventative. But I don't want a police officer in my home trying to dictate how my children behave and keeping them from misbehaving. I'd rather deal with that myself and be doing that in a humane. We want to raise our kids to be wonderful people, not people who live in fear of the repercussions of bad choices. So that's my argument when people say stuff about being against, being for police officers in school. My question is that I tried to have a conversation, social media conversation about this issue. And I had 3 people comment, all of them in favor of police officers in the school. One of them is a teacher actually in New Bedford High School. And I responded respectfully saying, I understand where you're coming from. I don't disagree with you. However, none of you have Black children attending these schools. They're all white people. So you nor your children have a sense of what it is to not only live in fear of police profiling you out in public, but also now every day in your educational environment as well. For you and your children, it creates a sense of safety, but for others, it's actually the opposite. But one of the teacher actually said, the resource officers at my school are Black, so I don't think they would be profiling, do you? If anything, they're looking out for kids involved in gangs and making sure they're peace at school and making sure nobody's being threatened. And I said, unfortunately, they definitely still do. So there's that issue that they like to throw back at. Well, if it's a Black resource officer, then they're going to have the Black students' backs, and they're going to them, and they're not profiling because they're Black. Like, I see Black police officers profiling people on the street. What are you talking about? But So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing, I think, and thank you for that question, because I think the thing is, we're talking about risk, right? So what Aaron put forward was the occupation of a police officer in a space isn't necessarily going to protect you, because when there is an infraction, they are trained to respond, not to respond in a humane way, right? Their training is, and this is from police manuals, their training is to eliminate the threat, right? And those words, when we think about what that means in court cases, what we see, like, again, here in Chicago, a young person got shot 16 times, right? And in the Chicago Police Department's manual, they say if there is fear for one's life, the duty and responsibility of the officer is to eliminate the threat. Now, here's where it gets testy. The Jason Van Dyke, who was convicted of shooting Laquan McDonald 16 times, was not convicted because he shot Laquan McDonald. He was convicted because he shot Laquan McDonald too many times, right? So now when we think about this, I think it really becomes important, because the respond to a perceived threat by law enforcement is not humane in the response, right? It is a violent response, right? So if you got a group of young folks existing under that, then that elongated trauma is going to do something. And to your point, I think this is what we don't see a lot of times as educators. And folks talk about this on the ground all the time. If you are experiencing trauma, the person that you will enact the secondary trauma out on are the people that you're in proximity to. So when we talk about fights in many cases are engineered by the trauma of the space that we're in, right? So when we talk about shifting school culture, those are the things that we need to be thinking about. And I think that's often missing from the conversation, right? It's the expectation that because somebody looks like you, that they will protect you, and that is not the case.
Yeah, excellent. So, I'm deeply interested in the Chicago case, because, I don't want to bring this, I know this is going to go much longer, and I don't want that to happen, but the Chicago Teachers Union, to my recollection, at one point, was calling for police officers in schools under the leadership of one president of the union. And then, and the reason why they called for more police officers was for teacher safety. So I'm wondering about the whole sort of union, educators union involvement in this. And then I remember there was a shooting of a 14-year-old boy in Chicago. I mean, not a shooting, it was a killing of a teacher. And the 14-year-old boy was the one sent to prison and just exonerated recently as a result of all that. So the whole question of the union, and the fact that, the CTU was against it at one time and then did a radical sort of change, and how that came about, all of that is extremely important to me. But I know we'll go on past 5:30, so I don't want to do that to you all. But I'd just like to say that our next community forum will be, we'll have some young people come on in organizations fueled by young people, like the Providence Student Union, the Philadelphia Student Union, and a few students in Massachusetts to talk about, the receiving end of punitive regimes in schools and police officers and so forth and so on. I don't want to keep you beyond 5:30. I mean, this discussion can go for hours for sure. I mean, very extremely illuminating. All of the speakers were terrific. A million thank yous to you for making the time to come on. We really appreciate it. We have some school officials on the line. We have some, I believe there's a city councilor on the line, and presidents of unions and some other folks. So we really appreciate it. I think this was illuminating to all audiences. Right?
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. If there's anything you'd like to say in closing, I'll open up the floor for you. You can take us home, so to speak.
Keep up the struggle. Appreciate all your work. And yes, unions can be forces for change. Unions can be forces not for change as well. I think it depends on the people that are in them, and Chicago Teachers Union and the movement for rank and file educators, that is the caucus that runs the teacher union, has done a lot of internal and continues to do a lot of good political education to bring, in particular, white teachers along around some of these critical issues, whether it's around school safety, whether it's around privatization, very important. So thank you for organizing this forum. Thank you for your work. I'm so excited that the next one will be young people, and I'm looking forward to keeping informed about what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And I'd also like to say shout out to the MTA, who is taking bold leadership in this matter.
Yep, indeed. Shout to Barbara Mandaloni and the homies in Mass who are doing that work. And Ricardo, thank you as always for keeping us on point and on deck in terms of doing right by young people, families, and the people that we care about. And to all the participants today, I would say, trust your struggle because it is a righteous one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. This is such a pleasure to participate in, and you know, these have been such frustrating times, and you know, we've got such a battle for justice and for kids that it's heartwarming to hear from you know, these panelists and people asking questions and participating, and learn more about your organization and the amazing work you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you all, and peace, joy, and justice to everyone on the call and all the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you all again.
Take care.
Okay.